Thank you so much for coming out. It is super dark and it is super cold, so it is really, really lovely to see such a full house with us here today. And of course, by here I mean not only this room and the city, but also these lands, this territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Fijian First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations. This was an agreement that dealt not only with the sharing of the resources of the Great Lakes, but also of the caring of these resources of the Great Lakes. And I'm grateful to the Indigenous Education Network at the University of Toronto and the Elder Circle of the Council of Aboriginal Initiatives for sketching really briefly both that historic and ongoing reality of this city, Toronto, that is at home at once both to so many Indigenous peoples, but also to so many immigrants like myself. And so this land acknowledgement then is a mapping of local dispossession and local colonization. And this is a political reality that imposes on all of us ethical imperatives. One thing that we talked about in the last session of the Sri Lanka series, and I'm glad to see a few familiar faces from that session, is that for those of us who are from the island, we are brought together today by our connection to places and to homes that are far away from here. And in both practical and emotive terms, the reality of the Sri Lankan war continues to shape our lives here and the lives of our families, our friends, our loved ones, and our communities. Nevertheless, as immigrants, our very presence here on Turtle Island is complicated proof of our own enmeshment in the local processes here in Canada and on Turtle Island of displacement, erasure, and colonization. And what that means then is that we need more than the often tokenizing gesture of land acknowledgements or the indulgence of leftist jargon. What we need is really clarity and courage in how we resist the seductive myths and the false promises of Canadian multiculturalism. If our commitment is to ending dispossession and death in Sri Lanka, then our commitment here must also to be ending the occupation of Indigenous lands here, these lands that have sheltered us, that have sustained us, and that continue to nurture us. And I think particularly as immigrants, we are called upon to stand up as proof of the successes of the Canadian state, right? We're expected to participate in the performative politics of recognition and of representation. That is to be grateful every time someone who looks like us is invited to the table, in particular of party politics. And yet this is the same state, the same country that in 2009 and 2010 mass detained upwards of 200 Tamil refugees and asylum seekers who were seeking refuge here from the war in Sri Lanka. And that included newborns. So more than ever, we need to be thinking beyond the state and beyond the really hollow premises of middle-class mobility. In lieu of patriotism, what we really need is that our loyalties be to the oppressed amongst us and to each other. So on that note of relationality and of community-based solidarity, I want to say thank you to our venue host, the Work is Action Centre, which is like a really incredible organization here in Toronto, a worker-based organization that is committed to improving the lives and the working realities of precariously employed people here in Toronto, which includes many people in this room, ourselves, our family members, our community members. Thank you also to Ramya, who has been our tech wizard today, who is helping with filming this, and for all of your tech wizardry. The recordings from today's event will go up on the website, srilankaseries.com, in the coming weeks to months. Thank you also to my fellow coordinators, Kiribalini and Mirisha, who are scattered throughout the room. And last but not least, I also want to say thanks to the Politics of Sexual Initiative at the City College of New York and the Transnational Law and Justice Network at the University of Windsor's Faculty of Law, and to the Tamil Worlds Initiative at the University of Toronto Scarborough for their institutional support. I also realized I forgot to tell you my name is Fatima. We're here as part of the Sri Lanka series, which is, for those of you who weren't here for our first session, a leftist alternative community lecture series. The goal is to examine the ongoing toll of the Sri Lankan war's repercussions, and we want to map the social justice mobilizations of movements that are happening on the island, and to approach these issues through a lens that is substantively transformative, that is meaningfully a challenge to the intertwined harms of state violence and capitalism. And for more information, you can definitely check out our website and also join our mailing list. We have sign-up sheets near the door and on the website. So today's session, the second in this series, as you know, is titled Deferred Homecomings, Combating Disappearances in Sri Lanka and in Canada. The impetus for this session comes from the fact that Canada faces an ongoing pandemic in the disappearances and murders of thousands of Indigenous women, girls, true-spirited trans and queer people. And meanwhile, Sri Lanka analogously boasts the second highest number of disappearances in the world, outranked only by Iraq. And the disappearances have been targeted disproportionately at Tamil people in the island. Now, in terms of state responses to these disappearances, Canada has instituted two inquiries into missing and murdered Indigenous women, the most recent of which is ongoing and is headquartered here in Toronto. Sri Lanka, meanwhile, has begun operationalizing its Office of the Missing Persons. In the face of these responses, community outcry has continued. In Canada and in Sri Lanka, women are at the forefront of protests, sit-ins, and hartals demanding the whereabouts of their loved ones. So today what we want to talk about is how these atrocities and the resistance to these atrocities are both similar but also importantly different across these contexts. There's, for example, an impulse to sometimes synonymize the experiences of Tamil people living in Sri Lanka with the experiences of Indigenous peoples living in Canada, and also to synonymize the nationalisms that have emerged from these kinds of contexts. So our hope today is to think in concrete detail about the ways, about the possibilities and the limits, importantly the limits and the possibilities of that kind of comparison. And to take us through that conversation we have with us, I'm really honored to say Megan Scribe and Dharsha Jegatheeswaran. Please join me in welcoming them. So Megan is a two-spirit Ininu Iskwar from Norway House Cree Nation. She is a fourth-year doctoral student in the Social Justice Education Program at the University of Toronto, where her research focuses on state violence in the lives of Indigenous girls while establishing links to Canada's ongoing settler colonial regime. In 2016, Megan was awarded the Joseph Armand Bombardier Canada Graduate Scholarship. She is a community member for Aboriginal Legal Services, community council member of Aboriginal Legal Services, a community researcher with It Starts With Us, and a planning committee member for the annual Strawberry Ceremony, which is hosted by No More Silence. And Dharsha, who is Skyping in today from Jaffna, is a Canadian lawyer who has been based in Jaffna, Sri Lanka since August 2016. She serves there as a research director for the Adayaalam Centre for Policy Research, and she's also the human rights director at the Washington-based NGO Policy People for Equality and Relief in Lanka. Dharsha holds a Juris Doctor from the University of Toronto and a Bachelor of Science from McMaster University, and she has conducted research and advocacy for multiple Tamil diaspora advocacy organizations and has attended the UN Human Rights Council on numerous occasions as an advocate on Tamil issues. And she has worked as a legal intern at the Colombo-based Centre for Policy Alternatives, which has resulted in the co-publication of a comprehensive report on illegal land acquisitions in Sri Lanka. So the format of today's talk will be that I'll guide Dharsha and Megan through just a moderated conversation on gender, nationalism, and resistance for about the next hour in Canada and Sri Lanka, and the connections between these two. And then we'll open up the floor for about half an hour of Q&A. And the way that we'll go through the Q&A is that we'll be distributing papers so that all of you can write down your questions if you have any, and we'll collect that near the 1 hour mark and go through those questions that way. Dharsha, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Excellent. Okay, so my first question is for you, Megan. So in the last 30 years, which is to say within my lifetime alone, we've seen a toll here in Canada of approximately 1,200 Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited queer and trans people who have gone missing or have disappeared. So that's 1,200 people approximately in 30 years. And I remember that when you and I talked about this a few days ago, you really challenged me on the use of the word crisis. And you said, this is not a crisis in Canada, it's a structure of Canada. Can you talk to us a bit today about what you mean by that? Like, how did these disappearances begin? What is the context of all of this?
So I guess in the days leading up to this, and I was thinking through this question, I'm torn. I want to talk to you, but I need to talk to you. So with all the recent media attention and the international awareness, this thing we call MMIW has emerged, and it's just given us this impression that that there is this crisis that has emerged maybe in the last 20, 30, 40 years, depending on who you ask. But the reality is that for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirited, and trans folks, this has been going on since the arrival of white settlers to Turtle Island. So when I'm thinking through gender violence in the lives of Indigenous peoples, I really want to shift the language from crisis to structure, because we wouldn't have Canada without gender violence. Canada is made up of all kinds of interlocking yet distinct oppressions, and this includes settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, ableism, and so on. So, yeah, we really need to think about it as structuring the world we live in.
And Dharsha, could you give us some background on the crisis of disappearances in Sri Lanka? Like, the war technically ended in 2009, so why do disappearances still remain a concern on the island? And what do people think has happened to the people who have been disappeared?
So I think to start, when discussing disappearances, there's actually a huge phenomenon of disappearances that happened before the armed conflict. So in the 70s and 80s, there was a rising up of youth in the South under a political state called the state. And in that context, the state actually brutally crushed their own and went door to door in certain villages in the South and disappeared a huge number of young men. So the phenomenon of disappearing, I think, to Megan's point, is very structural. And what those initial disappearances signaled to the Sri Lankan security forces is that they could disappear a mass number of civilian youth, non-civilian youth, and get away with it. And at that time, there were about 100 cases filed against or in respect of disappeared persons. Nothing came out of any of those cases. You then move into the armed conflict that we know, which is the conflict between Sri Lanka and CLPT. During that conflict, according to certain reports, approximately 65,000 persons were disappeared. And they were disappeared in different ways, and not just at the end of the conflict. So throughout the conflict, people were abducted in white vans, which is quite commonly known in Sri Lanka. People were taken from their homes. People were disappeared en masse from villages. So in the east in particular, the security forces and paramilitary forces would conduct roundups. And so they would come to villages and gather all of the young men, usually, and disappear them. But the disappearances in Sri Lanka were also not discriminatory based on gender. So during the armed conflict, a huge number of women and men were disappeared. And the largest number of disappeared persons that we're sort of most aware of now are those that were disappeared at the very end of the armed conflict. And this meaning between 2008 and 2009, a large number of people surrendered. So basically the military had come around at this last point in the conflict and said that anybody who had any connection or affiliation to CLPT, even if they had been forcibly recruited and worked for one day, had to surrender themselves. And if they surrendered themselves, they would, be okay. They'd be returned home after 2 days or 3 months. But if they didn't surrender themselves, they're confiscated. So in fear for those consequences, a number of mothers and wives, as well as mothers and husbands, surrendered their loved ones. Actually physically took them to the checkpoint and surrendered them, or told them that it was okay to surrender. And although we know a number of people did go through rehabilitation, which itself is a terrible process that was rampant with sexual violence and torture, and then came out of that process and are now back in society. There's also a huge number of people who just were disappeared and have never been seen again. So in terms of that's kind of a basic understanding of the context of disappearances in Lanka. But I do think it's important always to frame the disappearances during this armed conflict in light of disappearances that occurred before it, to fully grasp the kind of systemic structures that exist in Sri Lanka and what the community has done to reinforce disappearances there.
Thank you. Megan, a key component of your work has been stressing the need to ensure that the experiences of two-spirited people, queer people, and trans people are included in conversations about disappearances. Why has that been important?
Do you think I could respond to
Absolutely.
Dharsha?
Yeah, go for
So when Dharsha was speaking, Dharsha, when you were speaking, one of the things that came up for me when you were talking about the different ways that people are disappeared within the context of the Civil War and the events leading up to it, there's just this striking difference happening here in the Canadian context, in that it looks very everyday, and there's kind of everyday and ordinary quality to it. So, for example, a lot of the disappearances of Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited, and trans people happens in the context of school, for example. So, as some of you might be familiar, the Indian residential school system was in effect for over 100 years, and during that time, over 150,000 Indigenous children went through the system, many of whom did not return home, having been murdered while in these institutions, and then also in an attempt to free themselves, ran away and died on the way home. So even when this institution closed, there's been different iterations or reboots of this kind of structure. So following the close of Indian residential schools, what we see is the emergence of boarding school situations where Indigenous youth are compelled to leave home to continue their education because a lot of reserves only have elementary schools. And what we've found in the last 40 years is that when the youth go away, oftentimes they're exposed to just this tremendous amount of violence, and a lot of times go missing or are dying under these suspicious and violent circumstances. So, for example, in my own community, Norway House Cree Nation, a teenage girl named Helen Betty Osborne, she moved away to a nearby mostly white town in 1969, and then was brutally abducted, tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered while walking home one night. And I think what's significant about Helen Betty's case is that a lot of the features that led to her death are still prevailing today. So there is an inquest in Thunder Bay, Ontario recently looking into the death of 7 Indigenous youth, and still we are seeing a lot of racism and gendered violence towards Indigenous girls who are in the city. So this is the city where Barbara Kentner was brutally attacked when a white driver threw a trailer hitch at her and yelled, "Got one," and then died months later. So yeah, so thank you for bringing that up, Dharsha. Yeah.
Did you want to add anything to that, Dharsha?
No, I think that brings up an interesting point, right? Like, I think during the end of the armed conflict in particular, and during particular sort of attacks on operations, you're right, like disappearances were very seen as a normal, and they have normalized. We know that based on recent violence forced disappearances continue to date. However, the disappearances that continue the post-armed conflict context are a little different during the conflict. And I think the ones that are occurring now, over the last few years, some that kind of fit a little bit into the model of disappearances that you've described, because they're not highlighted with history, and they're not given that much attention together. and seen as sort of part and parcel of the fact that we live in very contrast in the north and east. And so in the north and east country, it's become so normal for the military to ground, and given what we know about the 34 experiences themselves, I think are kind of an extension of that. But during the armed conflict, and even sort of under the former regime's governance, disappearances were very much highlighted and brought to attention by a number of civil society groups as well as politicians. So I think it is a slightly different, a very different context.
So maybe that takes us to our next point, which is that notwithstanding that these are different contexts, notwithstanding that in one case it's more overtly militarized and in the other much more everyday, as you've termed it, we still see like mass mobilization in response from the communities that are affected by these disappearances. So we're seeing in Sri Lanka, like women who have been leading hundreds of days of protest now, and we're seeing very similar sorts of mobilizations here in Toronto. Could you both walk us through the history of these protests and your relationship to these protests? What does your work look like in relation to that mobilization?
Sure. Me first? I don't know. Okay. So the people I see leading grassroots and community-based initiatives are the people who have lost the most and have the least to gain from these socio-political structures that we're living in right now. So those people are Indigenous women, Two-Spirited and trans people. And I won't give an exhaustive history of what Indigenous resistance has looked like, but I will say that Indigenous peoples have always resisted Canadian colonialism. And this has looked many different ways, and it includes direct action responses, which often get labeled as terrorism or rebellions. And it also looks like letter writing campaigns, hunger strikes, and even negotiations where we come to the table with, in good faith. So with respect to gender violence, I'll give you one example, and it's about, so in the 1970s, there is a group of Maliseet women from Tobique First Nation who challenged some of the more obvious examples of gender discrimination within the Indian Act that stripped them of their Indian status and access to inherent rights. So what they did was they held sit-ins with their children at the local band office. They held a march where they walked 100 miles from Ganasataki to Ottawa to raise awareness within the Canadian public. And when the Canadian court system refused to address their complaints, Sandra Lovelace, with the support of her community, she actually went to the United Nations Human Rights Council, which ultimately ruled in her favor and, pleasantly enough, embarrassed Canada on an international platform, thus leading to some really important changes that that we're still benefiting from. So I am a recipient, and I am benefiting from the work of these women. I'm able to live in my community and access my treaty rights because of this. So I think even though it happened a while ago, it's still important to recall this. That said, I think legal approaches are important, but I don't necessarily believe that these will result in emancipatory or liberatory radical change. Where I've seen really, really powerful transformative change is actually community-based grassroots organizing. So a good example of this is the strawberry ceremony, which began in Vancouver's downtown east side over 20 years ago. This ceremony is the result of the intensive advocacy of family and friends and community members of this neighborhood. So they initiated this ceremony when the police refused to investigate the suspicious disappearances of their community members. And through this ceremony, they led their own investigations. They were able to protect each other from potential predators, and importantly, they were able to generate awareness for those people who might still be out there, and also grieve and honor the loss of their loved ones. So the strawberry ceremony is in so many different cities across Canada, including here in Toronto, and I've been lucky enough to be a part of it as a community member for the last 6 years. And one of the things I love the most about this ceremony is that it's sex worker led. It is two-spirited and trans people led. So what happens is there's a kind of calling in to community members who have been thrust out because of stigmatization, because of their different life circumstances and choices.
Dharsha, do you want to talk to us about the protest in Sri Lanka?
Sure. So resistance to disappearances in Sri Lanka has been going on for a very long time. And it's largely been led by families of the disappeared, which is used as a description in Sri Lanka to describe anyone who's had a loved one who was disappeared. But it's also been led by civil society. And I think the groups that I work most closely with now are certain families who disappeared, largely in sort of the Vandi district, which is where the last phase of the conflict happened, who have decided to take to the road and lead a nonstop continuous protest since February. So these are largely women, and their mothers have disappeared who have had experiences working with society since the end of the armed conflict to try and seek truth and justice for the fates of their loved ones, find out what happened to their children. And so what's interesting in Sri Lanka is, since January actually, there have been protests across various districts in the north and east. It started in a district called Valiant, and then they began in Kilinochchi, Mullaitivu, Madanankani, and then also in the east in Trincomalee. And in all of these places, you have mostly women mobilized to lead non-stop continuous protests on the road, or all trying to find the fate of loved ones. The modes of operation within these different protests and between the women's groups do operate independent of each other. So what I speak on is largely in relation to my experiences working with the women who have organized in Kilinochchi and Mullaitivu. While I also work with mothers in the other districts, they're not necessarily the mothers who are leading the protests in those districts, so I have met some of them. And what's really incredible actually about these protests, I mean, they're, like everything, these protests are political movements. But I think what for me has been the most interesting is that the mothers, when you ask them, why they decided to start protesting this year, why did they just kind of go about the normal modes that they had already been using to resist, whether it was, meeting with government officials and UN officials, or kind of doing that kind of advocacy. What they say is that they, were tired of having other people speak for them. So they were tired of having civil society take the lead and having civil society kind of step forward to speak for the mothers. And they felt very let down because 8 years after the armed conflict, they still didn't have any answers. Not a single case of it has resolved in Sri Lanka. And so a lot of them felt like the only thing they did was take back control of the space and kind of take leadership over the resistance. And so I think that the phenomenon of kind of resistance here has changed dramatically as a result of these protests. And these women have managed to make themselves a political force to be reckoned with, and inserted themselves into conversation directly as sort of victim survivor communities, rather than having to go through middlemen, whether that be civil society or politicians. Obviously, there are also downsides to these protests. There's been a significant deterioration of these women's mental health as well as physical health. So since this protest started, 5 women in Kilinochchi alone have died. And I think that that's something to be really cognizant of and aware of, that these protests, while I think they have been quite inspiring, they also come with significant risk to these mothers. And while I keep saying mothers, I think it's just because they themselves refer to themselves as the mothers who disappeared. But I want to be clear that not all who are protesting are mothers. A lot of them are instances whose husbands have been disappeared, or instances whose brothers have disappeared, and in a lot of cases whose daughters have been disappeared. And so I think that the mobilization in Sri Lanka right now with respect to disappeared is interesting, where you have mothers kind of reassert, but also sort of turning to more kind of grassroots street mobilization as a form of advocacy.
So I think that's a really great return to the question that I kind of awkwardly began, which is one of gender, right? So maybe we can start, Megan, like you've already used this phrase a few times, and I want to just sort of honor it, which is when you say Indigenous, two-spirited, queer, and trans people. Like, one, maybe you can explain what you mean by two-spirited, and also why it is that we would want to stress that in a space about women's,
Yeah, for sure.
experiences.
So I think the most important thing that you need to know about two-spiritedness is that it is an identity marker for Indigenous people. So if you are not an Indigenous person, you are not two-spirited. That's just if you take nothing else away from two-spirited, this concept, you are not two-spirited if you are not Indigenous.
Are we talking about Boyden? Well, we're not though, but.
I don't know.
Joseph Boyden, who...
Yeah, he has a really interesting definition of what two-spirited means. For him, it's more about being split between Toronto and New Orleans. That is not the definition I am working with tonight. Get that out of your brain. So the definition I use for two-spirited, it actually comes from a friend of mine, Alex Wilson. She's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan. She's from my home territories, so she's from a Opaskwayak Cree Nation, and her definition or her understanding of what it means to be two-spirited, it means to recognize yourself as a spiritually, a culturally, a politically, and a sexually meaningful person in this world. And I think how I've interpreted that definition is that it is about a whole person. It's about knowing yourself as being Indigenous, but having teachings that are very around sexuality, around gender, that are very specific to where you come from. And it's very different than how Canada or what other Western states would conceptualize gender and sexuality.
So why is that important in the context of disappearances?
I think that a lot of times terms like lesbian, bisexual, and queer haven't, these identities aren't big enough to fit all of me into it. So if and I think that's the same for a lot of other two-spirited people. So, some of us might use multiple terms to locate ourselves, but when it comes to being queer or bisexual or like a lesbian, a lot of times these identities kind of conform to these homo-national ideologies and structures. So their priorities are around marriage, for example, whereas being a two-spirited person or for trans people, our priorities are around not getting slaughtered in a genocide. So it's radically different.
This reminds me of a conversation that you and I had where you talked about the ways in which Indigenous people who don't conform to Western binaries of gender have been uniquely and disproportionately targeted for violence during these disappearances. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that I see happening in the media, in official studies, even in the conversations that happen within different grassroots initiatives, is that two-spirited, queer, and trans people are often just erased entirely from the conversation. So our whole lives, who we are as just existing in this world, so that happens. But also on top of that, the violence two-spirited and trans people experience is erased. I try to resist this approach to gender violence that uses the Western gender binary, because I think when we rely on Western gender binaries, we're kind of caught within this either-or framework where it's women and girls are victims of violence and men are bad guys, but really that's just not the case at all. So bringing two-spirited and trans people into the conversation is the difference between taking this view versus this view. So when we think about violence against two-spirited and trans people, I think we're able to get we're able to better address and ultimately dismantle systems of oppression. I'm kind of getting carried away in my head, but I guess I want to say one more thing, that I want to take a more expansive view of gender violence, that I think it's more than women and men. That gender violence is about attacking femininity, it's about attacking your sexuality, transness, and anything that poses a threat to the cis-het white order.
So maybe, Dharsha, when we talked about this same question, one of the things that, feels very different about understandings of gender in Sri Lanka is that whereas Megan has identified for us the ways in which the gender binary is in fact quite a Western notion, in Sri Lanka it seems like to raise issues around rethinking the gender binary or decolonizing the gender binary, that is perceived to be the Western intervention or the Western imposition. Can you talk to us a little bit about where, if at all, you've encountered conversations in the island broadly about broadening understandings of gender beyond a man-woman dichotomy?
So I think, as I mentioned to you in that conversation, I want to acknowledge that being based in Jaffna, I don't sort of have access to a lot of those conversations. Not that they are not happening, and they might be happening on a kind of private, small-scale level in the north as well. But I haven't sort of witnessed any of those conversations, at least in the north or the east. However, I have sort of seen the conversations happening in Colombo, which is the capital city, and I think that because it's the capital city, and again, you're right that even there it's sort of seen as an international conversation, but it is also being led by local Sri Lankans in Colombo. But I just wanted to add to one point that Megan raised. So I think with respect to the gender binary and sort of what it means and for the families that just in the north, one thing that I've sort of seen and I find a little problematic, well, very problematic, but I'm not sure how exactly we tackle it, the fact that the political conception of mothers disappear to reinforce these notions of gender, right? The fact that the women protesting can protest because they are mother, and what it means to her, and what it means to be a woman is defined as a mother or what identity becomes reduced to being the mother of the disappeared or the wife of the disappeared. And their sort of legitimacy comes from that relationship, or their legitimacy comes from the kind of traditional sense of what it means to be a woman in Sri Lanka. And I think I've seen that conversation happen within these movements, but also about these movements. And it's very reminiscent of, in Argentina, when the grandmothers and mothers of the disappeared began their protests, which have become sort of this globally recognized movement of a victim survivor community. This notion of kind of relying on the traditional respect given to a woman who has taken on the role of being a mother or being a wife is somewhat being reinforced by organizing and movements around that relationship. And so I think we have quite a ways to go in terms of speaking about gender binaries, but even speaking about what it means to be, what would it mean to be traditionally a woman in Sri Lanka, and what gives you as a woman in Sri Lanka, whether it's activism on here or activism on any other issue.
So on that point,
so I know that's not like a direct answer to your question, but yeah.
No, I think that's an excellent point, and I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about the ways in which the fact that these protests are being led by women, whether mothers or not, has affected the nature of that activism. Like, are their demands, are their tactics different than they would have been had these protests been led by men?
So I thought a lot about this question, and I think there's two ways of looking at it. One way is the fact that it's women who are leading these protests means that it's not necessarily an extension of existing political hierarchies in Sri Lanka. In the sense that politics, and I'm speaking largely, I should have clarified this at the beginning. I'm speaking largely about Tamil families that disappeared, but there are a number of single families that disappeared in the south, as well as some families, some of whom that we work with, are in sort of a political community. And I think one of the things that I think is that Tamil politics is largely dominated by men, and almost exclusively so. And so if you have protests, again, being led by Tamil men, often I think what we have found here is that they tend to be an extension of the political system. But when you have women leading these protests, women who don't have space in these traditional political environments, you almost break with that political system. It's not that they don't participate in, or often sometimes get stimulated by them, or they themselves try and use the system, but they become a separate political force. They're not seen as part and parcel of existing politics. And I think that that's an important tool for them, and it can also be used to their advantage, but it can also be to their detriment. And then the other part of this that I think is important to sort of look at, and something that I think a lot of wonderful scholars have written about, including Nimi Gowrinath, who I know that you know, is the fact that women in Sri Lanka who participate in these protests, who are involved in this kind of activism, as mothers of the disappeared, as wives of the disappeared, because they're women, they're expected to slot neatly into the box of victim. And so when they try and step out of that box, either to have a political identity or an opinion about anything aside from their victimhood, in a very warped way, it delegitimizes their credibility in the view of a large number of community members, but also problematically in respect of diplomatic missions working in Sri Lanka, who can no longer then see them as victims only and have an issue with some of the political stances they might take. And I think that it is because they're women. Because I would be hard pressed to find a male victim in Sri Lanka, male survivor in Sri Lanka, who would be forced into the box of victim at the very least by the Tamil community, and not be allowed to have a political identity. And there just seems to be this unfortunate, an unfortunate lack of understanding of the fact that their very sort of victim survivorhood is itself a political identity, and that women don't need to be affected to sort of like traditional sense of what it means to be a survivor and only for kind of stories, but then not allowing them to take on a kind of an active society. Yeah.
So with respect to protests and grassroots organizing, like Dharsha was saying, a lot of the people who are leading these movements are almost like forced or put into a position where they have to, because it's a matter of life and death at this point. So I guess one of the examples, or one of the things I'm thinking about is linked to the example I gave earlier about the Maliseet women of Tobik. And I wanted to think out loud about the different responses they received when they did all this important advocacy work. So when they were challenging the more obvious examples of gender discrimination, not only were they resisted by the Canadian state, but actually, surprisingly enough, Indigenous men were pushing against their efforts. And I think, so I want to bring up this example not as a way of saying like, ooh, Indigenous men, that's not it at all, but actually to think about the way Canada has always used this divide and conquer strategy to pit communities against one another, but even within communities pit us against each other. So with the Indian Act, everyone is oppressed. All Indigenous peoples are oppressed by the Indian Act, whether they are considered a status Indian or whether they are excluded from this legal body. But for those Indigenous people who are governed by this legal body, some of us are harmed more than others, just on the basis of gender discrimination, transphobia, and homophobia. So what this means is that Indigenous women, Two-Spirited, and trans people are going to experience more violence because of where they're standing at these different oppressive intersections.
Can you give an example of how gender discrimination unfolds under the Indian Act?
For sure. So what the women of Tobik were fighting for were primarily around marriage rights. So prior to 1985, if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous or a non-Indian person, she would lose her Indian status and therefore lose access to treaty rights. So the ability to live on her reserve, the ability to have a house, to inherit different things, and receiving support around education. Yet when an Indigenous man would marry a non-Indian woman, and this is deeply heterosexual, by the way, the non-Indian woman that the Indigenous man married would gain Indian status. So I think that's a really obvious example of how the Indian Act has discriminated against Indigenous women. And so when these women were challenging this act, and they received a lot of resistance from Indigenous men, I think that's a reflection of the fact that, like, if anyone of you have ever like not had any of the things that you've needed, like if you have ever gone without, you would know how hard it is to give it up. So I think the men at this point were scared of losing the little privileges and protections that this act afforded them. Had their Indian status been threatened, I think we would have seen a more collective approach.
So if I understand or gather correctly from both of your examples, it seems like the protests are not only resistant resisting the state broadly, but also in more subtle forms, resistance to patriarchy within our own communities. And you both talked this a little bit, but I feel like it would be great if we could spend a little bit more time on this. What does it mean then for those of us who are members of these communities? Like, how do we address those multiple layers of oppression? And how do we support women who are taking on the stigmatization not only of the state, the vulnerability not only at the state level, but also potential stigmatization by their own community members? What do we do as people within or around these protests?
So the way I see this happening today is through the stigmatization of people who are involved in the sex trade, people who use different substances, and the erasure of two-spirited and trans people. So a lot of times with different gender-based movements, it's the conversations are taking place on this binary that erases two-spirited people. A lot of times when Indigenous people, when we have different movements, it's often based in ceremony that is exclusive to two-spirited people. And I don't think that this is Indigenous. I think this is it's a reflection of ongoing colonialism, and this is the way it's been internalized. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important to think about the ways that even Indigenous women, cis Indigenous women, are enacting this kind of exclusion and violence. So that's something like that I think about myself as a cis person.
I think in the Sri Lankan context, it is kind of a question of agency. So I think the community could do much more to accept and respect the agency of women who have engaged in this kind of activism around disappearances. And because I found a common refrain that I hear when I'm speaking to kind of diplomatic missions or even kind of leaders within the community, it's, oh, well, you know, that woman is politician, and this belongs to that politician. It's ever kind of that, if no one bothered to ask the question, is it possible that these women are intelligent enough to realize that in Lankan context, given the security that we experience at all levels, that there has to be engagement at some level with politicians in order to actually advance whatever issue it is that you're advocating for, and that those politicians tend to be met. Like, there's never the question, it's never sort of question or possibility attributed to the women who are engaged in activism to say that perhaps they have thought this, and that they're not actually being used or manipulated by politician X, Y, Z, but they actually have the agency to make their own decisions, and that the political stances that they're taking are their own. So I do think in the Sri Lankan context, the community could really kind of support and help these women resist sort of patriarchal systems that we operate in, just by at the very least acknowledging their agency and acknowledging that just because they are survivors of these horrific atrocities, it doesn't mean that they can't be political actors in and of their own right, and that they can't have sort of opinions and views and a form of activism that goes beyond just their sort of issue, but also addresses these intersecting issues with respect to the state, as well as within their communities.